On a recent wintry day, I attended a gathering at the Department of Social Security, its national office in Baltimore, where they were going to name part of the building after a man named Bob Ball, who I suspect you have not heard of. He's not very famous, but he was the preeminent creator of our social insurance system, going back to its various earliest days. And one of the things that my father, who was also active in this movement, used to say about him was he could explain the intricacies of social insurance in terms so simple that maybe even a congressman could understand it. However, if Bob Ball were among us, he would not be content to have a building named after him, but would instead urge us to smarter and more vigorous efforts to educate and advocate for a system that has been successful for 75 years. My personal interest comes from my father, who, with several other people, wrote the Medicare bill. Having written it, he worked hard to get it passed. But the thing that's important to know about it, and why we are turning now to an intergenerational effort, is because those people who were at the very beginnings of our social insurance system always had an intergenerational approach to it. They did not think that they were just doing something for old folks.
One thing I really want to stress now that Alice touched on is that Social Security is more than a retirement program. Most people think about Social Security as something that only affects senior citizens, but as Al said, it's a disability program. People also get Social Security if a minor loses a parent. They can collect Social Security until they become 18. You also have some surviving spouses who maybe had a husband or wife who paid into the Social Security system but didn't have income of their own because they were a homemaker. If the spouse passes away, that person would still collect some surviving spouse benefits. So basically, instead of thinking about Social Security as a retirement program, we ought to think about it, as Al said, as a social insurance program. It insures you against the loss of your income. Here's that revenue compared with the expenditures of Social Security in 2012. As you can see, Social Security ran a surplus in 2012. It also ran a surplus in 2011, 2010, 2009, 2008. All this time when people are on TV telling you that Social Security is broke, it's been running a surplus. It's run a surplus every year since, I think the last time it ran a deficit was in the 70s. Does that sound right, Alice?
Yes.
So the trust fund balance at this point, after adding to it what we added to it in 2012, is sitting there at over 2.7 trillion, which on its face doesn't sound like something that's broke. If U.S. Treasury bond is a worthless IOU, then the dollar in my wallet, the dollars in all of your wallet are also worthless because they're backed by the same thing. A dollar is worth a dollar because the United States government says it is. A Treasury bond is worth what it says it's worth because the United States government says it is. And honestly, if the Social Security Trust Fund is filled with worthless IOUs, we have a lot bigger problems than Social Security. Our entire economic system is going to collapse. So why is it bonds in the first place? If you're the Social Security system and you have a whole bunch of money sitting around, $2.7 trillion, a whole bunch of money, there's basically three things you can do with it. You can have it sit around as cash, which it's not going to earn very much interest. I mean, you can't take $2.7 trillion to Wells Fargo and expect them to give you interest on that. It doesn't work. So you could have cash that's not really earning you any money. You just have it sitting around. You can put it in the stock market, which some people have advocated. There was a period of time that you might remember about a decade ago when the prevailing wisdom was that the stock market was going to go up forever and ever and ever. As you know, it does not. If we had done that before 2008, we'd be in a pretty bad position, especially because, as Alice said, Social Security is really vital to the economy, especially if there's recessions. When everyone was losing their jobs, seniors kept their purchasing power. And basically the third option is the bonds, which is kind of the best of both worlds. It's not as risky as the stock market, but it's also much more useful than cash, because without those bonds, Social Security wouldn't have earned that $109 billion in 2012. And the other point I want to make about that is Social Security does that by law. Ever since the 70s, they passed a law that says when Social Security has a surplus, they buy Treasury bonds with it. There's actually a special kind of bond that the Treasury produces just for Social Security. And this is an important thing to note, because there's a couple people that wrote in your cards about politicians keeping their hands off Social Security, and I'm not surprised that that's the case, because politicians in both parties always accuse each other of raiding the trust fund. Whoever's not in power accuses whoever's in power of raiding the trust fund, when really that's sort of a fallacy. It's an act of Congress never appropriated Social Security's money and took it into the general fund. Social Security took its money and invested it in treasury bonds, just like a lot of U.S. corporations do, just like private citizens do all the time, just like other countries do. It's an investment for Social Security. Yes, that money did go into the trust fund. It did go into the general fund of the U.S. government, but it's not because the U.S. government stole it. It's because Social Security invested. Every year the trustees do, they make some predictions. So we're just going to sort of use that as our starting point. According to the trustees, the last report that's available, which was the report released in 2013, summarizing 2012, they expect the Social Security surplus to continue to grow. So that means the system's going to keep earning a surplus every year until about 2020. The surplus will be over $4 trillion at that point. In 2021 is the first year that they expect it to start running a deficit. And it'll take about another dozen years, from 2021 to 2033, for the deficit to deplete the amount of money in the trust fund. That's what the trust fund is there for. So once Social Security is taking in less money than it's putting out, it'll cash in the bonds that it owns to keep paying the benefits. An important thing to note about that 2033 date, which is always changing a little bit, by the way, as the economy comes back, that date might push itself in the future naturally. An important thing to note about that date is that if we don't make any changes to Social Security, and 2033 comes around, and the trust fund gets depleted, that doesn't mean the program is over. Because in 2034, people will still have jobs. People will still pay into the system, and Social Security can still use that money to pay out. Based on the calculations, Social Security wouldn't have enough money to pay everything that's owed, so people on the system then would get about 78% of what they ought to get. But I think it's important to realize that the trust fund being depleted and the program ending are not the same thing. Obviously, we don't want that to happen, and politics being what it is in the United States, it's sort of unbelievable that it would happen, that Congress could look at a generation of senior citizens in the eye and say you're getting a 22% cut in your Social Security next year. But that's the situation we're in right now if we don't make any changes.
Not too long ago, my Congressman Meehan, came to talk at the retirement community where I live. And he said they were going to make certain changes in Social Security. But, he said to this group of elderly people, don't worry, it won't affect you at all. I said to him, Congressman, you have just insulted this audience if you think that we are only concerned about what would affect us. We are, in fact, very much concerned about our children and our grandchildren, at which point the entire audience clapped loudly and enthusiastically to say that, yes, indeed, they agreed with what I had just said. Of course, Grandma takes care and is interested in the grandchildren. We all know that. And, in fact, I can report that Congressman Meehan developed little beads of sweat on his upper lip at the reaction of the audience to chastising him for saying that he was doing something that wouldn't harm us old people. The only people who would have to worry about it would be the younger people. It is certainly true that they have had a system to work on convincing you that Social Security will not be there when you get around to trying to collect it. How many of you think that? Are you worried? There's one, two. I taught a class.
8 people think that now.
8 people think that. You've got it on the cards. Okay. I spoke at Drexel one time, and I was told that all the members of the class thought that they would never collect Social Security. And I said to them, well, are you working? Oh yes, most of them had a job someplace. I said, well, there is a form of social insurance known as workers' compensation. If you get hurt on the job, you could collect it right now. They didn't know that. So an education about what social insurance has meant and the kinds of breadth that it had, not only for a pension program, but protection for being hurt on the job, protection for health care and health care concerns. And furthermore, I think it has been true for a long time that, as I say, the intergenerational aspects of it were in the minds of its founders.
Obviously, we don't want the trust fund to deplete in 2033 and for everyone's benefits to be cut by 22%. So that means we have to go somewhere from here. As Alice said, you know, any program is going to need changes to be made to it. Plenty of changes have been made to Social Security throughout its history so far. So there's a few things we could do. Cutting Social Security is one option that is supported by a lot of folks. Not a majority of folks, if you believe any poll, but it definitely has support. Alice mentioned the chain CPI, which is the most popular way that people talk about cutting Social Security. And it's popular because it's one that's going to be hard to notice, because if I'm a Social Security recipient, I'm used to getting an increase most of the time on January 1st. So if the chain CPI came in, I would still get an increase, but it would be less of an increase than I would have gotten before. And so it's hard for the seniors themselves to recognize that cut, because they're still getting an increase. They're just having a cut to their increase. Does that make sense? So it's a politically easier way than just saying we're going to reduce everyone's benefit and everyone sees their check get lowered. So the chain CPI, it would violate what Congressman Meehan said to Alice's group, because it would cut Social Security for people in the program now. And this is about the amount of money people would lose. You know, for someone who's 65, you know, by the time they're 70 years old, they lose $600, et cetera, et cetera. Now, for those of us that are not in the system yet, you know, for you guys, this is a gigantic cut to your future benefit, because that chain CPI is going to be applied to the Social Security system, you know, for another 30 years before you start collecting it. So that, you know, the longer you wait before you collect it, the more it's going to affect you. So it's going to, you know, it would be a small cut for Alice. It would be a gigantic one for me. It would be an even more gigantic one for you. We could also make improvements to the system. Alice mentioned this bill by Senator Harkin. I think since that fact sheet came out, the House version was proposed by Linda Sanchez. It does phase out the payroll cap, which, doing that all by itself, pushes that 2033 date to 2049. Doing nothing else to the system would do that. You know, that's a reform that a lot of people support, because at the end of the day, what it would do is it would say everybody in the United States pays the same rate into Social Security. You know, there's a lot of folks that want to do that to our income tax system and say everyone should pay a flat tax. Social Security's taxes aren't flat; they're sort of, and they're not progressive; they're regressive. The less money you make, the larger of a percentage of your income you pay into Social Security. So, you know, I pay 6.2%. Probably everyone here so far has paid 6.2%, and you probably will for most of your lives. But, you know, the Warren Buffetts of the world, they stop paying their Social Security tax on January 2nd, and they end up paying, instead of 6.2%, they pay 0.00000000, you know, more zeros than I care to say, 1% of their income, because they stop paying after they make that $117,000. And if you're going to make $1 billion in a year, you're going to be paying a pretty small percentage of your income. So getting rid of the cap just basically says everybody pay the same rate into Social Security, 6.2%.
As my father said, any social program will have to be modified and adapted over years to meet changing circumstances. But let those modifications and adaptations be done by its friends and not by its enemies, who in the very first instance from 1935 until this day have wanted nothing except to destroy it.
And it's important to remember the history and the reason why Social Security exists. Because at the end of the day, Social Security is an excellent example, probably the best example in our history maybe, of the government solving a problem. You know, people use the word poorhouse sometimes in our, you know, as you're talking, and people talk about ending up in the poorhouse. That's an expression. You know, nobody actually expects to end up in the poorhouse. But the fact of the matter is, before Social Security, that was a real thing. There were real places called poorhouses, and senior citizens lived in terror of ending up there. especially women, because back then a lot of women didn't work, and if they outlived their husband, they also outlived his pension, which is, by the way, this is a picture full of women living in a poorhouse. Social Security took this out.
I used to do in talks was, I would say, the fact that Social Security is going bust is simply not factually true. It's good for at least 20 years. But if I look out at you, I say to myself, that might not be too comforting for you, right? You're not going to be 65 in 20 years, are you? So the point is, if we're going to preserve this for future generations, we have to learn to work together to make that possible.